Hey guys, welcome back. It's day 73. It's also July 17th, 2019. And we are in Fairfield, Idaho. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig. And this is my story, a story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. From Oregon's John Day River area, we'd continue our trek across eastern Oregon, crossing through places like Vail and Nisa and into Idaho. All across the area, the importance of agriculture to the area's economy is obvious. We'd continue about 150 miles up the road where we would spend the night pulled off to the side of the road just outside Fairfield for some shut-eye, but not before doing some reading about this place called Idaho. I first wanted to read a bit about the state of Idaho, and not surprisingly, how little I actually knew about it. I'd learned that, as is the case for most of this area, it was first discovered by white settlers in the early to mid-1800s. Lewis and Clark would trek through here on their way to the west coast, and along the way, Idaho would present some of the most harrowing and legendary treks for the early explorers, given the steep mountainous terrain, riddled with deep canyon river areas, and just about every other type of landscape you can imagine. And the harsh winters, they certainly didn't help. Near the middle of the century, French Canadians would discover gold in the Pend d'Oreille River. The area would be considered a territory for many years, while states all around it would form. Initially as part of the Oregon and Washington territories, but once state lines had been determined for those two states, the area would be referred to as part of the Colorado Territory for a short period before achieving statehood in 1890. And ironically, as I headed east, I'd quickly learned that I was headed directly into the real Wild West of the time. The first indicator would be the historical markers. I'd spent a good amount of time standing in front of historical markers all across Washington and Oregon, but they were different. To this point, historical markers had tended to talk about the discovery, settlement, and development of an area, and the fearless pioneers that made the journey on foot. Moving into Idaho, the content of the historical markers would immediately shift to that of conflict. Brutal and bloody conflict all across the area. It quickly became clear that as the Native Americans fought to the death in a valiant effort to protect their cherished land, the lands that they and their ancestors had called home for literally centuries, from what they considered, because I guess it was, an invasion, a takeover. These strange-looking new peoples began trekking through and then staying on their land, and simply calling it theirs. One of the first of these conflicts I would read about would be the Bannock War. The Bannock War of 1878 was a significant armed conflict that unfolded across the rugged landscape between northeastern Oregon and Idaho. The war itself would last nearly 3 months while battles raged between the U.S. military and the Paiute warriors indigenous to the area. The Bannock people had evolved as a distinct group of the northern Paiute nation of Idaho. They had migrated during the 18th century south to the Snake River Plain, forming alliances and living in peace with the Shoshone people of the area. It would be this group of Native Americans that would become known as the Bannock peoples. The natives of the area had suffered losses due to the European-introduced diseases, so the melding of the two tribes proved beneficial for all in the forms of security, protection, healing. The tribe would also develop a horse culture, enabling them to explore a broader area, including treks along the Bannock Trail through Montana and into Canada on buffalo hunts, hence the name. As Lewis and Clark explored the area, initial contact had been peaceful. Expedition from not only the U.S., but Canada as well, had become engaged in trade with the tribes of the area. They would trade everything from horses and firearms to, of course, furs and even jewelries from both cultures. They would maintain this relationship for decades while maintaining their independence. But eventually, their dependence on this trade would become more of an issue as the area reached the end of the 18th century. The issue heightened for the Native Americans as white settler growth in the area increased. This would lead to a decrease in trade with the Native Americans as settlers turned more towards traditional forms of commerce. Settlements were growing, and regular supplies were coming in from the east. Tensions would only heighten when gold was discovered in the area, driving the growth rates and traffic even higher, not to mention all the illicit activity that comes with a gold rush era. Just ask Canyon City, Oregon. And just as importantly, competition in the area for game and water resources would only add to the tensions. These tensions would boil over, and everything would come to a head when the U.S. military faced off with the Bannock Paiute warriors in 1878. Fierce battles would break out all across the region, lasting for months. Record-keeping of the time, obviously, makes it tough to get an accurate count of casualties, but it is known that the Paiute Bannock warriors would number over 500, and that the U.S. would commit over 1,000 troops and $500,000 on the conflict. And that conflict would leave settlers in the area terrified. No one seemed to know where the next battle would break out, or when. The Bannock people had spent decades trading for firearms, so in most cases they were as well armed as the U.S. forces, and they knew the lay of the land in far greater detail. But even so, the U.S. would throw so much money and so many soldiers at the conflict that ultimately the Bannock people would surrender. Many would return to the safety of the Fort Hall Reservation, but while safe from military conflict at Fort Hall, their activities were heavily restricted, so nearly all of their autonomy and connection with the land was lost. And in the end, the U.S. military would round up over 500 Paiute people from Oregon, Idaho, even Nevada, and intern them with Bannock prisoners at the Yakima Reservation in the southeastern territory of Washington. This would not be the last time the Yakima Indian Reservation would serve the U.S. military as an internment camp. During World War II, I would learn, over 1,000 people of Japanese ancestry would be rounded up from throughout the Yakima Valley. An order signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for the evacuation of all people of Japanese descent across the West Coast. These evacuees were compelled to board specially chartered trains that took them to an assembly center at the Portland Livestock Exposition Grounds in Oregon. From there, they would eventually be interred on the Yakima Indian Reservation as well as other camps across the area. It was at this point in my reading I had to pause for a second. I think my brain was locking up a bit. First, how had I made it around the sun 54 times, and I did not know that after the U.S. military killed nearly 300,000 Japanese people by using a nuclear bomb, that we then established 10 internment camps across the country where some 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned. Clearly, there's more learning and enlightenment to be gained here. What were the strategies? And in fact, maybe, how many American lives had been saved because we took action first, rather than the Germans or Japanese doing perhaps the very same thing, only with Americans at the opposite end of war's gun barrel. But I had to put all that down for right now and get back to our trek through Idaho. And Fairfield? For us, as I mentioned, after driving through the Idaho National Forest and into the foothills of the Sawtooth National Forest, It was literally a place to grab a few hours of sleep alongside a stretch of road bearing the historical marker for the Bannock War. And I gotta say, I might be getting a little bit addicted to this whole pullover, eat, explore, sleep, and then go again concept. But for the folks that call Fairfield home, some 400 or so of them, Fairfield is the county seat and in fact the only incorporated city in Camas County, Idaho. The town represents nearly half of the county's population, the rest of which is spread over multiple communities across the county. So if a little space and time is your aim, it doesn't get much better than this. The city's official website refers to the town as a quaint little community nestled in the foothills of the Sawtooth National Forest. Finding much in the way of history would require some digging, but what is clear is that the area, beyond having deep roots in Native American history, was born in agriculture, and it still resides there today. And with the Soldier Mountains, as well as the Smoky Mountains, both part of the Sawtooth National Forest, well within reach, the area is also known for just about any kind of outdoor activity you can think of. And if the 15 Seconds of Fame game is your thing, Fairfield was featured in a Season 2 episode of The X-Files, in which Scully and Mulder would investigate a fictitious zoo. And Fairfield's dusty Main Street, yep, a lot of dirt roads around here, along with a mom-and-pop ski area, a gas station, and a market, gives the locals just about anything they need. For more serious shopping or medical needs, they'll trek 60 or 80 miles away to places like Haley or Twin Falls, Idaho. Standing alongside this historical marker, watching the sun come up, a few deep breaths while looking in one direction, wide open rolling grasslands as far as I could see, and in another direction, the Sawtooth Mountains cutting a shape into the morning light, making it obvious how they got their name. All the while, absorbing how easy it is to understand why so many fought and died, why so much blood was shed here, to keep this land, or to take this land. As we drove through and out of Fairfield later that morning, I started thinking about all the other things I'd read about Idaho, like the extreme diversity of the state, from places like where we are right now in Fairfield to even more rural communities, to places like Eagle or Ketchum, Idaho, both very popular, much more densely populated, and each boast a highly educated demographic and strong educational systems focused on their children, and median home prices ranging from $700,000 to over $900,000, placing them as some of the highest median home prices in the nation. And on to Boise, the state's largest city at nearly 250,000 people, was named the nation's fastest growing city in 2018. A YouTube channel called Placeaholic might have said it best when summarizing Idaho, nicknamed the Gem State. Are there more wild and rural areas to live in? Yeah. Are there more populated places to live? Sure. But the Gem State is the perfect place to reside if you enjoy easy access to both. It would also be reading, watching videos, and learning more about this place that I would learn that the United States is the only country on the planet that has designated wilderness areas, a focus and a movement that began early on in the country's history. More than any other country, the U.S. has committed to and enforces a commitment to the country's wilderness areas and the habitat that live there. Much different than a state or national park, wildlife reserve, or even a national monument, essentially the Designated Wilderness Act took public lands out of the hands of federal agencies and placed them under a congressional act of protection. It would take years, but in 1964, the Wilderness Act was signed into law, entering 9 million acres into the government's wilderness protection. Of the 9 million acres, the largest area of protection is the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. It's 1.3 million acres are right here in Idaho. And just one example of how protected these areas are would be river rafting activity along the Selway River. During the rafting season, only one launch per day is allowed onto sections of the river, meaning if you want to experience a piece of what true wilderness is in today's United States, you sign up and get on the list to be on one of these launches under careful guide activity, or thousands apply for a permit to self-launch each year, but with only 60 launches per year available, a very low percentage actually get to see and do things that are truly special. Some even call it epic. These places truly are protected from man. In fact, the original legislation even states that man is meant only to be a visitor in these areas, never to stay. In some areas, hiking and horseback are the only options in or out. Mountain bikes are not even allowed. They're considered mechanized. And of course, goes without saying, no motors. Thinking through all this as I drove through the expansive landscape in front of us, I sort of lost track of where I was, not to mention where we were going. And then I drove past a sign that read, Old State Highway. I wonder what we'll learn there. Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously, you can.